As Joan said, my name is Ryan McMahon. I'm Anishinaabe from northwestern Ontario. My home community is Couchiching First Nation, my mom's side. My dad's side is my dad is from Rainy River First Nation, and my dad's dad was a white man, a Scottish man, who came here to Canada as a young boy to live with his family and to start their life here. I have a bit of a bronchial infection, so I'm going to cough intermittently, and so I apologize for that and for the disruption and distraction that it certainly will be. This conversation about how to teach about residential schools is a really important conversation, as Joan alluded to. I think is the evolution of where we've come from in this conversation, which is we're moving from a place of awareness, kind of sitting through what I would deem or call residential school 101, trying to help people understand that these schools did exist, that they were intentional and purposeful efforts to forcefully and violently assimilate Indigenous people into the body politic under the guise of the Canadian colonial project. And up until 1996, these schools existed in this place. And the last school that closed in 1996 out in British Columbia, I was in high school at that time. And so when we talk about, where we've been in terms of Indian residential schools and the fallout therein, we have to acknowledge that this history is very recent history. And the intergenerational effects of residential school and the way that it impacts my generation, the generation below me, and generations to come can be measured. And I think it's really important that, as Joan alluded to in her opening comments, that we create a common language to understand this conversation and some very basic truths about the intergenerational harms of what has happened here. Many people across Canada can't put into context, the current state of Indigenous life. They may see the news, they may pick up the newspaper, and they may see headlines that show a pretty disparate and pretty desperate life for many Indigenous people across this country. We're talking about communities still fighting for clean drinking water, talking about communities that don't have schools in their own communities, and therefore their young people have to be shipped into towns or to city centers for them to attend school. We're talking about poor health outcomes, poor educational health outcomes, and the downfall, the trickle-down effect of this assimilation system that was created here in Canada is still being felt today. And some would argue, and I certainly argue, we're probably in a worse state than we were when the residential schools were open. We now know about things like the 60s scoop, to me as harmful and as dangerous as residential schools themselves, right? Where in the 60s, 50s and 60s across Canada, it was common to remove Indigenous children out of their families under the guise of child welfare and other made up measures of whether parents were able to care for their children or not, and put them into non-Indigenous families. And not just move a kid from this house across the street to a non-Indigenous family, moving kids across provinces, across countries, across the ocean. This was the politics of the day. And the fallout of the 60s scoop, what we call the 60s scoop, continues to this day in the form of child welfare. There's a massive piece of legislation in front of the Canadian government now where they're trying to negotiate a civil action, a class action, to help pay for the harms of the child welfare system currently in Canada. And so Canada, over the last 160 years, has abjectly failed Indigenous people and families and communities over and over and over again. And that's the common understanding that I think we need, that we can point to physical schools that stood in Indigenous communities that had 4 walls and a roof. We can point to those schools and go, man, that is such a shame. That's so bad. I'm glad they don't exist anymore. But we don't get to do that because we know that while those schools are largely removed from our territories, and though some still exist today physically, the residential school in my home community of Couchiching First Nation still stands today. It's an office building. It's been renovated and remodeled a couple times, but most people in my community never step foot in that building. You know, they won't even go in that building to update their status card because it is the residential school. And so starting from this place where we understand that the fallout and the effects, intergenerational effects of residential school are very, very real, is a very, very important place to start today. I brought my hand drum today because I wanted to use this as a bit of a teaching tool. Now, in my language, the Ojibwe language, we call our drums dawei gun. Dawei gun, that word in Ojibwe means hand drum. But when you break up that word dawei gun into its many parts, what this actually talks about, this word dawei gun, is a heartbeat. And it's the heartbeat of our people that we believe that when we sing on these drums, that heartbeat is represented through our songs, through our prayers, through our ceremonies. And just the fact that I'm sitting here today with my hand drum, that I had to wrestle out of the hands of my 1-year-old, by the way, because Thomas absolutely loves our hand drum and he plays it with me each and every day. But the fact that I'm sitting here with this hand drum in my hand and about to share a song with you is proof positive that what is important for you to understand today is that the assimilation, as violent and as cowardly as it was, did not work. And we are here each and every day picking up the pieces of what is left out of these policies, and what is left out of our knowledge systems, out of our hearts, out of our minds. And the songs that we sing to honor residential school survivors. We sing to honor those that have come before us. And that when we sing these songs, we do so in reverence and in prayer. And so I want to sing a song that was given to me that honors survivors themselves before I go any further in my comments today. It's really, really important that we understand that residential school survivors themselves are most often absent from these conversations, right? That in Canada, what reconciliation has become is almost, and we won't go too far into this today, and maybe we can do it in a subsequent talk, but the Reconciliation Project in Canada has sort of become a recolonization project in many ways. And why I say that is that, reconciliation in its earliest days and earliest forms was all about education. It was all about understanding where the heck we've been, what happened, why it happened, how it happened. And we grappled with this, and we were led by brilliant thinkers and generous, kind, compassionate, and caring leaders like Murray St. Clair, right? That dragged this country kicking and screaming into the future by showing and telling the damages of residential schools and what survivors have been through. And if it wasn't for survivors themselves being able to stand up in the face of these atrocities and share their stories, this country and the world would never know the truth. And so it's really important to take the time to reflect on those survivors that are still with us today, and to put your good heart, your good mind out for them as we sit here and gather this morning. Jimmy Chandana, Jimmy Chandana, Anishinaabe, Jimmy Chandana, Jimmy Chandana, Anishinaabe, hey, that was a song that was given to me in Whitefish Bay by a guy named Chuck White, who was a song composer and a singer for the Whitefish Bay Singers for many years. And he told me that we sing that song for those that, because the words in the song say, thank you very much for helping the people. And I sing that song as an honor song because that to those that help the people. And in my mind, if it wasn't for the class action lawsuit by survivors themselves, there was a civic suit and a lawsuit that was started the process began through the 80s and 90s. But survivors themselves started to come forward to say, they wanted their grievances heard. They wanted their experiences honored. And slowly but surely, litigation started by individual survivors and small groups of survivors. And pretty soon, there was a massive wave of litigation that Canada just could no longer ignore. And in fact, once it started to become public and the media started to report on it, then and only then, was it clear that that Canada had a problem. And through the early 2000s, Canada and the church were trying to ignore the problem. They thought that through litigation, actually, eventually Native people wouldn't be able to pay for these court cases, and as such, is Canada's sort of legal strategy when it comes to fighting Indigenous peoples in court. They think, well, the longer we fight, the more tired they get, the less money they have to fight, they'll probably give up. Well, that never happened here. And in 2006, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was created to basically come up with, it was the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, but it was basically a mechanism to come up with a way to get out of the courts and to create a system to honor residential schools, the survivors and their experiences through this litigious process. It's really important to note, we're talking about how to teach residential schools, how to talk about residential schools. In my mind, you need to go back to long before the apology made by Stephen Harper, long before the reconciliation movement begins under Justin Trudeau and the federal Liberals in 2015 and 16. And you have to go back. You have to go back. The word in our language is "be skabiyung," which means looking back in order to look forward. And so the proper way to talk about and teach residential schools is creating the historical context and the historical underpinning of how we got to these moments. The TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was created by residential school survivors themselves. I never hear people in popular culture state this fact. Murray St. Clair many times has, but this is a sticking point that when people forget this point, I go out of my way to either email people or to approach them publicly, privately, and say, I think it's really important that we say that that it was a pot of money that came out of the TRC, $60 million out of the civil lawsuit and the civil action against Canada that created the original pot of money that created the TRC. So it wasn't a federal government. It wasn't a special Senate group that came together to do this. It was residential school survivors themselves that gave us the TRC. A very important point to remember and something to champion, because without residential school survivors putting that money into the pot, we don't know what would have happened. We don't know if we would have got a TRC to draw out of that work and to better understand what had happened. And so through the selflessness of survivors themselves, we get the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A second key point on how to teach and how to talk about residential schools is to really understand why and how they were ran regionally and territorially. It's okay to generically understand that there were these schools across Canada and that various church denominations had their hands in delivering on the promises of these schools through education, through work, and through keeping children away from their family. But it's really important to understand regionally and territorially how and why this happened. And so I'll use my home territory as an example. In Northwestern Ontario, in Treaty 3 territory, it's the highest concentration of Indian residential schools per kilometer. And so in our land base, in our territory, the highest percentage, the highest concentration of residential schools there. This was important because the way that lands and waters were used to transfer children and the way that residential schools actually helped build the road system, the railway system, that in Canada's earliest days, these schools were addendums to the political resolutions that were being put in front of Canada in its earliest days. And so Indian children, Native children themselves were being used as political pawns in trade to ensure that the road systems and the expansion of Canada was complete. In 2016, I made a film called Colonization Road. You can Google it. It's on YouTube. You should be able to find it on CBC Gem. But I broke down how residential schools and Native children themselves were being traded against the creation of this country through infrastructure projects. And so in Canada's earliest days, when they started to build the road system and the railway system across the country, they were doing so with the promise of, well, if we can just push this road a little bit further this way, we'll be able to get bang for our buck, as it was proposed, by placing these schools here. And so the expansion of Canada under the guise of the assimilation program that was being created through a very short amount of time in this window of time is really, really important to understand, because it's not that we cannot separate the creation of these schools as like, well, there was a few bad actors that had a few bad ideas. Instead, we have to understand that the infrastructure project of this country was a promise to the assimilation project, so that we could get these kids to schools and we could start to get resources out into the hinterlands to build up this country. And so I think it's a really important piece of information that often gets overlooked and is far outside of the sort of the breadth and the scope of the 101 information that you'll find out there. I think another important consideration when talking about residential schools is that, you know, when children, so I'll use my family again as I'll use my family as my family story as an example in this context. But it was always thought that if you removed children out of their homes and out of their communities into these schools, that you would somehow successfully be able to remove their language, their culture, their worldviews, their understanding out of their lives, and therefore it would be, it would be soon be an afterthought, and that just never worked. While it's safe to say that some residential school survivors do talk about some of the benefits that they experienced from the schools, my grandmother being one of them. My grandmother faced unthinkable and unimaginable human atrocities while at residential school, as did my mother, as did my other grandmother, and as did one of my grandfathers. So 3 out of 4 grandparents and one of my parents. And even in the face of that, my grandmother would talk about some of the ways that residential school benefited her. She was able to learn how to sew. She was taught how to bead and certain things that they were taught at the schools. And this to her gave her a purpose in her life, right? It gave her a way to meet other children at the school, gave them activities that they enjoyed doing well at the schools. And in her mind, I think certainly while the abuses that she faced while at the schools were not worth the trade-off, that she was able to focus on and take some of the positives out of her experience. Now, I bring this up to say that while some of the survivors that you will hear out there talk about their experiences will say that, there was some benefits to this, that the harm that was done is immeasurable. We cannot measure family per family or community by community how much trauma has been handed off, right? I grew up in a household of survivors, and I don't remember receiving a lot of hugs as a child. There just wasn't a lot of hands-on parenting, hands-on love, and that has negatively impacted my life. I am in therapy to try to work through my own intergenerational traumas and the harms that I feel as a result of being raised that way. But when I became a father 21 years ago, I vowed that I would hug and love my children each and every day. And so to this day, when my 21-year-old goes walking by me on any given day, she receives a big bear hug from her dad. And I go out of my way to show that personal affection and that love, because in our family systems, the thing that can't be measured is the impact and the loss of love, and how love really was at the heart of the assimilation project. And so when you talk about residential schools, you have to talk about the way it directly targeted the family unit. And why do we see a disproportionate number of Indigenous children inside of the child welfare system today? It's because we've never been able to recover from the fact that our family units were completely destroyed. I somehow, by some miracle, was not taken away from my parents by the child welfare system. I should have been. Both of my parents are drug addicts and alcoholics. The first 9 years of my life were spent in a violent home with drugs and partying and all sorts of insane things that happened every single day of my life. I remember these things. And I don't know why child welfare didn't come and pick us all up. There was 4 of us, but they didn't. And by luck, we weren't taken away to be raised by someone else. But I say that because, you know, today when I look at the child welfare system and why Indigenous children struggle today, it's because we still haven't repaired or fixed the hole in our hearts left by the intergenerational traumas, right? And so when we see our houseless brothers and sisters out on the street, and when we see our people struggling, I know what that struggle is. I have been there. And again, by luck, by some hard work, by some personal commitments, I've managed to correct my life and to stay on a better path. But not everyone in my family is that lucky, you know? And so I say this as a you know, the third way that I think it's important to talk about residential schools is to look at the intergenerational effects and to not supplement them with, like, you know, the measures of, like, well, you know, taking data points or taking, you know, different trends inside of different industries, whether it be education or health, and look at these and sort of flatten them out and say, well, this is the experience of Indigenous people, but instead to understand the nuance and complexity inside of each and every family unit, because we all have different experiences. And while I think the intergenerational harms are important to mention, each and every experience is different and needs to be honored. The fourth thing that I think is important to consider when talking about residential schools, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, is to go back to the beginning, is that, you know, to provide the historical context of why these schools were so damaging and so harmful, is because Canada was built on a deal, right? This is the Gashwinta. This is a replica belt, but this is what we call the two-row wampum, and this was given to me by a belt maker named Jamie Miracle. He gave this to me in 2000, and I'm not Mohawk. My hands burn when I touch this. Okay, I'm Ojibwe. I'm not even supposed to have this in my hands. If there's any Mohawk people here, I know you're going to threaten me in the chat. So just let me tell you how I got this before you try to come and take it from me. But he gave this to me and he said, you're going to have to teach with this. You're going to have to show people this to remind them. And at the time, I was 20 years old, you know, 21 years old. I had no idea what the hell he was talking about until I started to come to learn this story of why the Gashwinta, the two-row, is so important. This is Canada's first law. This predates Canada's Confederation. This predates the twinkle in the eye of the colonizers that came here. This is the agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. This was made at the Treaty of Niagara, where they agreed to live side by side forever, never crossing each other, never disrupting each other's right to life and way of life, but instead living side by side forever. You'll see these purple lines never intersect. They never cross. This was the agreement that we believed we were living under when Canada was created. Now, there are all kinds of other wampums and treaties and legal. This is a legal document. These aren't just baubles and trinkets. This is a legal document made by Haudenosaunee hands, given to the Dutch as a promise to live in peace forever. And so there were many of these. The Haudenosaunee made these agreements with Anishinaabe people. There are covenants and belts that were traded and distributed across these lands for hundreds and hundreds of years that gave us our legal understanding of how we were to live amongst each other. And so in Canada's earliest days, when the agreements were put out in front of us, we would have never imagined that we were going to end up in schools, that we were going to end up in these parcels of land. We were hoodwinked. And I think that a way to talk about residential schools is to talk about the context of the day before the first school was even open. Because the day before the first school was even open, this was the law of the land. This is what we were doing in this country. And to this day, there is no better law than this. There is no better scenario for this country than this, where Indigenous people get to live unencumbered lives, free, liberated lives in their homelands, next to the greatest country in the world, Canada. This would be a brilliant vision for this country if it were not for our history. And so, how to teach about residential schools? Going back to these concepts and these agreements will fundamentally help you understand why Indigenous people are so brokenhearted today, is because we thought we had a deal, right? And I'll come back to this. I'll come back to this in a little while. And I wish we were together in the room and everyone could have a chance to touch this, because it's so beautiful in the hand. And to think that, Haudenosaunee people made these, as an offering to say, you can stay here. We can figure this out. Is a beautiful, beautiful vision for this country. And it's one that was not shared by those that came here in Canada's earliest days. And so I want to get back to now. So we've talked a little bit about, contextualizing and putting a framework around the past. I want to talk about the present, right? And what Murray St. Clair and all of the other leaders, Marie Wilson, and Wilton Littlechild, the three commissioners of the TRC, as they brought these national events across the country, it's really important to understand that, Indigenous people are not a monolith. We are not a single thing. And that everybody's experiences across this land were similar, but different. And so if you want to understand the residential school system, I encourage you to dig into the executive summary of the final report. Now, the executive summary of the final report is easily Googleable. You can order copies of it from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. It is the closest thing and the best thing we have to a true statement of facts in this country. And if you've not read it, and if you've not ever had your hands on it, I encourage you to find it, to download it. If you're at work, don't tell your boss, but photocopy it. It's about 260 some odd pages. You might get in trouble for photocopying that much, so sneak it. But as a statement of facts for us to work from, it is the best thing we have. Now, why is the statement of facts important today? Well, it's really important that if we're going to teach about residential schools and talk about residential schools, that we face the fact that because of the way that our media is melting before our eyes, and that we have this new deep distrust in journalism and in media, that we get to say things like fake news, we get to say things like residential schools weren't real, we get a large uptake in residential school denialism. And shockingly, there is a massive trend in this country to outright deny not just the existence of residential schools, but the harms therein. And so there's a growing group of people across this country that have deemed it necessary to go out in public campaigns and to call into question whether these schools were real, what the intentions of these schools were, what the final report of the TRC says. They all are now weaponizing this anti-DEI rhetoric that we see in the United States. They're now weaponizing this concept of special interest groups paying for special interest reports, that they are discrediting the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That is happening today. And so we cannot talk about residential schools without talking about the rise in denialism. Now, this is hard to get your head around because it is so unfathomable that we are in this place in this country where people feel brazen enough, they feel brave enough to go out there publicly and say things like these schools were fabricated, they were made up, and that these schools weren't as harmful as survivors say. And so grappling with the current reality that denialism is on the rise is really, really important. It's okay to question. It's okay to want more information. It's okay to play the devil's advocate if you feel like you have to do that when you're at a dinner party. Nobody likes that guy, by the way. But if that's you, I don't mind. You know, there's one in every family. We'll still invite you to dinner. We just might not ask you to stay for dessert. You know, see you later. Did you eat? Yeah, you're all done. All right, I'll see you next year. You know, so if you're that guy, that's fine. But it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to want to know more. But the statement of facts is in front of us. It's irrefutable. The work that Murray Sinclair and others did through the TRC in the form of that executive summary will give you every answer and every starting point you need to better understand this work. And so today, if you've not already done so, grab the executive summary of the final report, do yourself a favor and give that a read, because I think that you'll find just about everything you need there to win the argument with that one family member that may be coming over to dinner sometime soon. Another thing that the sixth thing that I think is important to think about in teaching and talking about residential school today is the fact that we are still just scratching the surface in our understanding. Now, around the halfway point of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, Murray St. Clair rang the alarm bells to the federal government and said that increasingly the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is hearing stories as they travel across the country of mass burials, of children not coming home. And increasingly, Murray St. Clair was saying that as these stories are being gathered, it's clear that there is a large chapter of this story that has never been told. And it's one that alarmed Murray, and it's one that he asked the federal government in support for extra support for. And at the time, I want to say, I might be wrong on this, so don't quote me. I want to say Murray asked for an extra $4 million for the TRC to look into this idea of mass graves or mass burials. And because he had heard so many stories of this. And the federal government said no. They said there was no extra money, there was no additional funds to be had to support this work. And fast forward all this time to the 250 anomalies that were found at Kamloops Indian Residential School just a couple of years ago. And the truth shows itself, you know, once again. There are parts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work that this country is going to grapple with for decades to come. Things like medical experiments done on children, food experiments done on children, many other truths like whether electric chairs were used at residential schools as a way of and a form of punishment. These are the truths that will continue to roll out of the work. And so when I hear Canadians say this a lot to me, they say, you know, when is it going to end? You know, when will this end? Like, you know, we keep hearing of these new things, and like, how can this information just be coming out now? And the truth is, you know, when you fill up a jug of water and the jug is full, you can't get any more water in it. And I think that that's kind of where we are right now in Canada, is that we are the full jug. There is no more water going into that jug. And until we pour a little bit of that water out, we got no more space for it. And, you know, there are civil lawsuits and other types of lawsuits going on across this country right now, connected to the work of the TRC that is starting to express and to show other various impacts of things that happen at residential school. And so it's really important contextually, again, to set the table and to say, you know, through time, only time will give us the full scope and truth of what happened at residential school. There's still a number of survivors that never got the chance to share their common experience through the work of the TRC. Many survivors themselves couldn't afford to attend these sessions, while survivors were supported in helping to travel to some of these TRC events. Many weren't well enough to do so, and so we're still trying to grapple with some of those stories. And of course, we know the federal government continues to fight against the release of these documents to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation today. You know, they're in an ongoing court case, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, to have the documents kept in archive forever. And the government in Canada doesn't want to do that. The churches certainly don't want to do that either. It wasn't until very recently, 2021, 2022, where, you know, many Catholic churches that were implicated in this finally agreed to admit their role in what had happened here, and start paying out the awards that were given through various lawsuits to survivors and to communities. And so, you know, there's still this behind the scenes battle that no one pays attention to, where survivors and their communities and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation continues to try to fight for access to this information and access, you know, to these documents. The last thing that I think is essential to understanding how, you know, how we can talk about Indian residential schools, you know, today is to understand that we don't know how to talk about it. We've never been here before, and so the words in the Ojibwe language that talk about bravery and courage and humility, you know, these are the concepts that I think we need to walk with. Some people call them the seven grandfather teachings, but I don't know where the seven grandfather teachings title really came from. These 7 words in the Ojibwe language are words that we use as teaching elements, and so I'll kind of share this conceptual framework with you that I think is really, really, really important to take us forward, you know, into the future and how we talk about residential schools. The word truth in the Ojibwe language is dubwewin, and the word truth, the word dubwewin translates loosely to truth in English, but I think can all agree English is a bit of a lazy, miserable failure of a language. And what the word dubwewin actually means when translated from its many parts means to speak only to the extent to which you've lived or experienced. And so what we're trying to talk about when we're talking about residential schools today is to speak to the extent to which we've lived or experienced. Well, who's lived or experienced it? Indigenous people themselves, right? Who's lived or experienced it? Residential school survivors themselves, right? Who's lived or experienced it? 60 scoop survivors themselves, right? Who's lived or experienced it? People that have survived and come out of the child welfare system. So it's really important that we grapple with the stories closest to the source. For a while, this country embraced the work of people like Gord Downie, right? The Downie Wenjack Foundation, I think, does very good work and important work. But Gord Downie, in his final days, heroically, by the way, commits and dedicates his final waking days to the work of reconciliation, right? And he starts telling Canadians to pay attention. He tells Justin Trudeau to do better. Gord Downie, for those that don't know, one of our most celebrated musicians of all time in Canada, lead singer of the Tragically Hip, a very, very influential artist here in Canada. And Downie says, you know, I'm going to commit my final days to this project. Well, that's great. And Downie finds this story of this residential school attendee named Chani Wenjack. And he was a young boy that ran away from school. And when he ran away, from the residential school, he froze to death on a set of train tracks. Well, this breaks Gord Downie's heart. He writes an album and commits his dying days to creating a foundation, the Downey Wenjack Foundation, which is a foundation that works on educating Canadians and students on the impacts of residential schools. Well, I think that that's really cool, and it's really important that Gord Downie did that. But had Gord Downie Googled the name Chani Wenjack before the formation of his foundation and everything else, had he Googled the name Chani Wenjack, he would have found the name Willie Dunn. Willie Dunn was a Mi'kmaq singer-songwriter who died in obscurity and in poverty in Ottawa, who in 1970 wrote a song about Chani Wenjack and became the first Canadian ever, a Mi'kmaq singer-songwriter, the first Canadian ever to make a music video when he made a music video with the National Film Board. So the project, rather than it being about Gord Downie in his final days and the creation of the Downey Wenjack Foundation, could have been Gord Downie elevating the stories of Willie Dunn and other Indigenous peoples that came before him and help tell those stories so that Canada can embrace the stories of Indigenous people rather than embrace the story of Gord Downie himself. And so this is an example, a very clear example of how reconciliation can become a recolonization project in this country where we center the wrong people, we center the wrong voices. And it's really important that if we are looking at the truth of this matter, that we speak to those who have that experience. The word Tapwewen means to speak only to the extent to which we have lived or experienced. And those survivors are still out there and they want to tell their story. So to act in, to speak through truth would be to listen to survivors themselves. When we look at courage and bravery and humility, these elements, it's going to take a very humble person to be able to sit back and to take in this information and to try to grapple with it, to try to understand it. And I ask that everybody, find that courage to be humble and to find that bravery to kind of ask questions that feel uncomfortable, because this process is uncomfortable, right? It's a very uncomfortable truth that we are here today in 2025, kind of grappling with how we move together through some of these questions. And by the way, reconciliation is completely optional, right? There's 111 of you here in this room. You opted to come here. You didn't have to. You weren't told by the government you have to take 3 of these classes before you can renew your driver's license. So that would be certainly a way to get people to listen to these stories a little bit more than they do. But reconciliation is an optional thing for this country, right? Canada does not have to reconcile with Indigenous people. This is a question of social responsibility and political responsibility, right? What kind of country do we want to be if through this work? And so I'm going to leave my comments there for now. I'm going to turn it over to the chat and to our hosts to see if we have any questions or comments. I would appreciate taking questions first for those that have questions, and I can try to do my best to answer the questions. And then for those that want to have more of a sort of a conversation, we can open up the floor to you then, but I'd like to go to questions first if we could.
Awesome, thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat. If people want to start, please go ahead. Yeah, we have a question and also a hand. Yeah, Brian, go ahead. What do you prefer to to answer first?
Yeah, are you aware of any collaborations between Canada's First Nations and other groups um, seeking to heal from attempted genocide, i.e., Holocaust survivors or Rwandans? It's a great question. Am I aware of any collaborations? Yes, I am. There were a number of different types of collaborations that have happened at the Wabano Center in Ottawa, and the Wabano Center in Ottawa is an Indigenous health clinic. It has doctors and nurse practitioners and counselors and healers and different things, but they run a number of other community programs. And they were trying to do an interfaith, intergenerational healing circle as the conflict in Palestine started, and as it grew, and certainly as calls for ceasefire grew, and people from all sides came together to try to create a space, a healing space where people could talk and better understand each other. And I think that to me, in this country, we can do more of that and should do more of that. There are also all kinds of different interfaith projects that I've heard about in Winnipeg, in Saskatoon, and in other places where people have worked together to try to understand each other. And I think that this is the great promise of Canada, is that we all come from somewhere, and sometimes that shared history, that shared conceptual framework of what trauma does to our lives and the way it impacts our families and otherwise, we're a lot closer together than we believe, or than we know, or that we understand. And I think that the great promise of Canada is that we can do more of that work together. But the best, I forget the title, I forget the name of it. You may be able to see it on their website, but I forget what it was called. But it was at the Wabano Center, and up until very recently, just before Christmas, I believe it was still happening every other Thursday. So that's an example of groups coming together to better understand each other. Do you feel we can do more as a community to support? I mean, I don't know. I think that this is one of the problems in Canada, right? Is that we have these very uneasy truths about what has happened in this country, and it kind of handcuffs us all, right? Like it kind of makes me feel shy, and it makes you feel shy, and it feels like the problems are too big for one of us to kind of deal with, head on. And so it creates this this almost paralysis, right? I think that what we can do in this country is to do what we can to better understand each other. And when it comes time for us to exercise our right as voters, as community organizers, as interfaith groups that want to make an impact, make a difference, we can come together in many different ways, many different contexts, right? In almost every urban center, in towns or cities across this country, there are things called friendship centers. And Indigenous friendship centers are sort of ground zero for Indigenous life. They're always looking for people to volunteer in programs and to participate in programs. They're literally called friendship centers. They're places that started back in the 60s and 70s. And when people come together at them, right, often we share food and we share activities and different elements of culture. And so, when we gather in places, in spaces like this, I think that that's us at our best. And so finding ways to be supportive in educating ourselves and others around us, I think is the best place to start. And outside of that, looking at how we can make an impact inside of each other's communities in a respectful way is a really, really challenging thing to do, but not impossible. And I would say that friendship centers are an excellent place to start. There's one in Toronto. There's one here in Hamilton where I live. Fort Erie, down by Niagara Falls. They're scattered all throughout the province. I think 130 some odd of them, 64 of them here in Ontario itself. So lots of different opportunities for people to come together that way. Go back up. Great to have events bringing together. Yes. Do we know why the government of Canada is so afraid of the Indigenous people having a voice regarding the atrocities that occurred in residential schools? Vian, I think that one of the ways in which the fallout, political and legal fallout, really hurts Canada is this, right? Is that Canada made a deal, and so on the table, politically, legally, is a question of Indigenous people's nationhood, right? And how the federal Liberals campaign on this concept of nation to nation agreements, right? And under treaties, Indigenous communities like mine in Grand Council Treaty 3, we argue that though we signed the treaty with Canada, we never agreed to cede our land. We never agreed to hand over our livelihoods and our lives over to Canada. We would have never have done that. And so our interpretation, our understanding of treaty is very different than Canada's. And when it goes to the Supreme Court, when we go to court to fight Canada, we almost never lose. And so Canada has gone through, legally and politically, has gone through this sort of pacification of Indigenous people to say like, oh, we're going to do something, watch this. And then, there'll be a new special initiative, some sort of funding will be announced. And that's supposed to, make us feel better about where we are. And then, a little while later, it'll be, Indigenous people will go, well, this isn't working. Like, what are we doing? And then Canada will go, oh, don't worry. We got it. We're going to do something else. And through time, that is the way it's gone here in this country. That doesn't work. And so we're now in a place where Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples themselves are asking, what the heck are we doing here? How are we getting out of this? And certainly where I'm coming from in my homelands, in my home territory, we are thinking as a nation, we are acting as a nation. Grand Council Treaty 3 is a powerful force in this country in terms of where we are locally and regionally. All of the goods and services that make its way across this country go through our homelands, including many of the natural resources that flow through. And so, there's a large political question in front of us about how we correct that relationship. And it's one that, continues to this day. So why is Canada afraid of that? Because I think its own nationhood is in question when you start to look at Indigenous nationhood politically. So that's how I would answer that. Wanted to know if there are more people like Ryan who are willing to come to the Newcomers to Canada link classes together. Yes, there are many, 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 many. And Tareem, we can provide a list or a list of names. Probably Joan and I could probably put something like that together to get more names of presenters and folks that is the name of your movie about the residential schools, Colonization Road. Yes, thank you. What can we do to help Indigenous people who suffer from the aftermath of intergenerational trauma? It's a great question, Lance. I don't know. I mean, to me, compassion and empathy is really important. I think it goes a long way to helping our neighbors understand the complexity of the issues at hand. I think that those of us that come into this conversation in earnest and choose to be a part of this conversation, we are very lucky. We're very fortunate to have this shared space. But not everyone that we know is here, and there could be 6,000 people here to sit and listen to these stories. And I think that the more compassion and empathy that we can find in our own hearts, the more we can help to help others understand what has gone on here, the better. And I think that, when we think about Canadian history, we don't often think about Indigenous history. But for those of us that are interested in Canada's history, Indigenous history is Canada's history, and vice versa, right? We can't separate this in some sort of special categorized little group that it's kind of like a side project that we get to opt in or out of. This conversation needs to be mainstream. It needs to be broad, and it needs to be nuanced. We need to bring everyone into this conversation. So I think, how do we help those that are suffering? Compassion and empathy, and ask people to share that amongst themselves and with each other. Any other questions? Programs to go in person visiting Indigenous communities, understanding words. Yeah, Ahmed, I would say, friendship centers. Go to your local friendship center and have a look around, attend an event. There's always something happening at your local friendship center. They're always looking for volunteers. I think I can confidently say friendship centers are always looking for volunteers. When I was 12, I volunteered at my local friendship center to teach people how to read and write. So I was helping in ESL and literacy programs as a young person. It's an example of some volunteer work that I did back when I was very young. And this kind of work inside of communities happens every day. And so I would again point back to friendship centers in urban communities as a good place to start to help understand what's happening there. In the GTA in Toronto, there are places like Anishinaabe Health, Council Fire, NAMI Res, the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto. Though these are places that you could go to lend a hand. Yes, you can go to the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres. That is the provincial body. But if you go on that website, you'll be able to see a list of all the friendship centers and the organizations there that are working in the community. Okay, I think that was all the questions. So again, just to recap, talking about residential schools on a go-forward basis, moving out of sort of the 101 of where the conversation has been stuck at for quite some time, I think is all about context, and it's all about really personalizing the conversation and grounding it in a historical context that is inarguable. And I think that the rise of residential school denialism is a shocking reality here in this country, and it's one that we ought not to play with. We ought not to give it any space. We ought not to give it any time, and we need to fight that type of denialism with fact. And so, again, inviting people back to the executive summary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report is the best resource there is in Canada that will act as a statement of facts for this place, and I think is widely accepted by leading academics, government officials, Indigenous leadership as the closest thing we have to a statement of facts. And so providing that historical context, connecting it to the present, and looking at how we build better futures is, I think, how we need to start to talk about residential schools today. We are 10 years on. 10 years from the release of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This year, it'll be 10 years. And for 10 years, this country has created a context in which we can engage with this material. And the 101 information is important, don't get me wrong. But I think finding new ways to have this conversation is a really, really important change to where we are today, and a great challenge, but one that I think that we're all ready for and prepared for.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Ryan. I think we covered most of the questions. I don't know if anyone else wants to share or ask questions. I think that's it. John, would you like to say something or hold the space here? John?
Oh, and Ryan does it again. So let's see. We have the Mohawks coming after you, and the English language people, and then the Downey Wenjack people, and the neutral, all in one afternoon. Not bad work. No, fabulous again. I mean, just thank you so much. A couple things I did want to comment on or just add to. The executive summary is a free download. So you can download it for free and then transfer it to your Kindle and just listen to it on the subway, whatever. It's like Natalia's, there people I work with are laughing, but I mean, I'm an audible person, right? I mean, so yeah, so it goes pretty fast when you're listening to it. So I just wanted people to know that, because we're not going to be photocopying it, Ryan. We can come to your house and do it. Thanks for suggesting it. Bonnie's probably really thrilled that you did that. And the other thing was the question that about are there any collaborations of people doing healing for from genocide? There actually, I did come across this a couple of years ago. It was the National Association of Japanese Canadians. They have an intergenerational healing circle with Indigenous people, and they meet in Vancouver. That was it. So thank you so much. I think that I hope this gives people a little bit more confidence to have these conversations, because it's not, it really is kind of like an elephant in the room. I mean, you know, you get to a certain, it's like going out on a date and you get to a certain point and then you just kind of go, I don't know what to do. Do you know what to do? Do you know what I mean? So I think it's really super important. And so I'm really glad that we did this. Although I am sad that we're not in person, because that would have been great. I've never actually seen a wampum belt in real life, so I would have loved to have seen that. I mean, it might be helpful for people to know how long it takes for one of those shells to be made.
Yeah, so I think it was when it was given to me, Jamie said that, because this is about, I don't know, how long is this? This is about 4.5 or 5 feet long. It's very, very long. Jamie had said to me that he had worked on it for 2.5 years, and he didn't know who he was going to give it to. He didn't know who he was going to give it to, but once he met me and, you know, we knew each other for about a year, he saw the work that I was trying to do, and he said that he put the, you know, the finishing touches on it over the course of about 9 months. And so, you know, I don't know how much this shows up on this camera, but, you know, these are all little individual wampum shells, and they're all woven together. So, you know, he's a master belt maker, and took him a long time.
Oh, that's amazing. I want to see it. Does anybody else have anything to say? No, we're all good. Okay, nobody's upset. Bonnie, you haven't said anything.
I don't know what else I can say, Ryan. It's just always such a huge pleasure and an honor to have you come and speak with us and to be able to learn together. And I'm sorry you're feeling lousy, and you know, it's that much kinder of you to spend this time with us. So I hope you take good care, and I hope we get to see you again soon.
Yeah, I just did want to add that it was Ryan who was going this week when I said, hey, it's going to snow. And he went, I come from Northwestern Ontario. You were going to come out in this feeling like this? I can't believe it, because you didn't mention that you were sick.
Yeah. I was in bed for almost a week, and I mean, there was, just put on some long johns and a good pair of boots, and off you go. I'll go stand in the snow with you any day.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. We'd like to thank Agincourt Community Services again, and just everybody else who made this possible. I mean, it is not just about me. It's Natalia, it's Sage, it's Carol, it's Bonnie, it's the TRC committee. It's everybody who comes together to make this happen. So once again, thank you very much for all your help. I've probably forgotten somebody, and I didn't mean to do that. So please don't take offense. Yeah, so have a great afternoon. We will go over to the other room just in case anybody needs to talk. Other than that, have a fabulous day. Did you want to say anything, Dave?
No, just thank you, Ryan, and take care of yourself. Get rid of that nastiness that you got.
I will. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Bye.